The wedding bells were still echoing through the shrine when my heart dropped. As the priest finished his blessing, I felt my new mother-in-law lean close, her breath cold against my ear. Anata wa kachikanai. I froze. Even without understanding much Japanese, I could feel the weight of her smirk. You are worthless. The words sank into my chest like a stone. And for the first time that day, I wondered if marrying into this family had been a terrible mistake. I met him on a rainy spring afternoon in New York City, and even now, I remember every detail. I was rushing down Fifth Avenue, late for a meeting, clutching my useless umbrella as the wind whipped it inside out. My heels slipped on the wet pavement, my hair plastered to my face, and I remember thinking how much I hated New York in the rain. That's when he appeared. Calm, composed, like the storm didn't touch him. He held a black umbrella over my head, his other hand gently steadying my elbow. His smile was quiet but warm, and his eyes met mine as though he already knew me. "Daijoubu desu ka?" he asked softly. I didn't know the words then, but I felt the meaning. Are you okay? He was Japanese, working in Manhattan for his family's import-export company. At first, I thought it would end there, just a kind stranger who helped a clumsy girl in the rain. But it didn't. He invited me for coffee that afternoon. 1 cup turned into 3 as we sat by the window watching the storm clear. I learned his name, his laugh, the way his shoulders shook when he tried to hide his amusement. We became friends. Long walks through Central Park, talking about everything and nothing. He'd bring me lunch at my office, and I'd leave him little notes in his briefcase. Friendship turned into something else so quietly, I almost didn't notice at first. Late-night dinners, where the world outside faded away, where even the waiters seemed to disappear as he leaned in close to tell me a story about his childhood in Kyoto. Mornings when the sun came up too fast and neither of us wanted to let go. The night he proposed, he took me to the Brooklyn Bridge. It was late, the city lights shimmering on the river, the air cool and sweet. He stopped halfway across, turned to me, and slipped a delicate platinum ring onto my finger. His hands trembled only slightly as he said, "Will you be my wife?" I thought my dreams had come true that night. We talked endlessly about our future in Japan, about a home full of love and quiet gardens, about children laughing under the cherry blossoms. I promised I would learn his language, his traditions, everything I needed to belong. He said, "I know my parents can be a little traditional," his thumb tracing circles on my hand, "but they'll love you. They just need time. You'll see." And I believed him. Oh, how completely I believed him. The airplane doors opened and the humid summer air of Tokyo wrapped around me like a heavy, wet blanket. Everything was alive. The blinking lights of vending machines, the sing-song chimes at the train station, the smell of sweet soy sauce and roasted chestnuts drifting through the terminal. His parents were waiting at Narita Airport. At first, I thought I saw a smile on his mother's face. She bowed slightly, her kimono immaculate, her hair pinned in perfect waves. His father stood beside her, hands clasped tightly behind his back, his gaze sharp and unreadable. "Yoku kite kuremashita," which he translated as, "Thank you for coming." We drove to their home in the countryside, an old wooden house with sliding shoji doors and a koi pond in the garden. There was even a small ceremony waiting for us when we arrived. The family lined up, bowing and clapping as we stepped through the gate. I thought, maybe this will be okay. Maybe they've accepted me already. But when I looked closer, I noticed the smallest things. The way his mother's bow was barely lower than mine. The way his father avoided my eyes. the way the others murmured behind their hands as I struggled to remove my shoes and stepped clumsily onto the tatami. I smiled anyway. I thought I could win them over. But as the sun set and the lanterns glowed in the garden, I felt their eyes on me, watching, weighing, waiting. And for the first time, I wondered, had I made a mistake coming here? It started small. So small that I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. The morning after we arrived, I woke early, eager to help prepare breakfast and show my willingness to be part of the family. I padded into the kitchen to find his mother already there, her hands moving with precision over a row of small plates, pickled vegetables, steaming bowls of miso soup, grilled fish. I bowed politely and said in careful Japanese, "Otetsudaii shimasu ka?" May I help you? She glanced at me, her lips curling into something that almost resembled a smile, but her eyes were sharp as a blade. "Daijoubu desu," she replied, curtly. "It's fine." Then she added, in a lower voice, as though speaking to herself, "Gaijin wa kowashite shimaimasu." Foreigners just break things. I pretended not to hear. At breakfast, his father sat at the head of the table reading the newspaper. When I tried to greet him, he barely grunted, not even lowering the pages to look at me. I sat on the zabuton cushion as they passed dishes around. But when the plate of sashimi reached me, his mother pulled it back before I could take any. "Too raw for you," she said in English, with an edge of mockery, as though my foreign tongue couldn't handle real food. When I tried to contribute to conversation, they spoke faster, their voices rising into an impenetrable wall of Japanese. Every laugh felt like it was at my expense. Every silence felt heavy, like a judgment. At dinner that night, I clumsily used the chopsticks, dropping a piece of tofu on the tablecloth. Gasps all around. His mother hissed through her teeth, muttering, "Manners, disgraceful." I apologized in English, then tried again in Japanese, but they just shook their heads and avoided looking at me. By the third day, they stopped bothering to translate their conversations for me. I would sit through entire meals in silence, my cheeks burning as they talked around me. One evening, I found myself left alone on the porch, watching fireflies dance over the koi pond, while laughter echoed from the family room. It hit me then. I wasn't a guest here. I wasn't even a daughter-in-law. I was an intruder. And no matter how much I smiled, no matter how many bows I gave, the looks they gave me whispered the same truth, over and over again. You don't belong here. If the first few days felt like frost, the weeks that followed were a full winter. At first, I thought I could thaw them with patience, but their coldness only grew sharper, more deliberate. One morning, I came downstairs wearing a soft pastel dress, one I had chosen carefully after reading about Japanese modesty and elegance. His mother's eyes scanned me from top to bottom, and she let out a quiet laugh before saying in Japanese, "Sono iro, baka mitai." That color looks foolish. When I asked my husband later what she meant, he only smiled weakly and told me not to take it personally. But it was hard to not take it personally when at every turn they reminded me of how unwelcome I was. At a neighborhood gathering, his father introduced the family to the other guests, but skipped over me entirely, as though I weren't even standing there. Later, I heard him telling an older man in a low voice, "Kanojo wa haji da. Gaikukujin to kekkon suru nante." She is a disgrace, marrying a foreigner. During a family trip to a summer festival, I dressed in a beautiful yukata I had bought with my own savings. I had practiced tying the obi for weeks to make sure it was perfect. But when we gathered for a family photo by the lanterns, his mother hissed at me to step aside. "Ie, anata wa koko ni wa hairenai." No, you don't belong in this picture. And then, right there in front of everyone, she pushed me gently but firmly out of frame. I stood there, trying to keep my composure, while the camera flashed and they smiled. Even small things became weapons. The way they forgot to save me a seat at dinner, the way they criticized my cooking when I tried to help, the way they rolled their eyes when I spoke Japanese as if every word from my mouth was wrong. I began to feel like a ghost in their home, walking silently, invisibly, careful not to disturb anything. One night, after they had gone to bed, I sat alone in the dark tatami room, clutching my phone, scrolling through pictures of my family back home. I whispered to myself, maybe I made a mistake coming here. But something inside me, faint but stubborn, answered back. No, not yet. Not without trying everything. And so I resolved to stay, for now. At first, I believed he would protect me. After all, he had been the one who told me, "We'll face everything together," when he slid the ring onto my finger. But facing his parents was another matter entirely. Every time his mother snapped at me or his father sneered, he simply looked away. Once, after his father called me Gaijin no Onna, foreigner woman, to my face, I ran upstairs, trembling, and waited for him to follow me. When he finally came, hours later, his words stung almost as much as theirs. "Gomen ne. They don't mean it. Please, just have patience." I stared at him, incredulous. Patience? They treat me like garbage. It's how they are. You need to earn their trust. They just don't understand you yet. That became his refrain. Gambatte, be patient, they'll come around. But weeks turned into months, and nothing changed. I watched him avoid their barbed comments, watched him laugh nervously when they mocked my language mistakes, watched him excuse himself from the room whenever the air got too heavy. In public, he was the perfect husband, holding my hand, smiling softly, translating when I stumbled. But at home, he became small, quiet, almost invisible, the same way I was expected to be. One night, after another long dinner of awkward silence and forced smiles, I confronted him. "Why don't you stand up for me? Why don't you say something?" His shoulders sagged, and he whispered, "Because in Japan, we don't confront family. We avoid conflict to keep the harmony. It's how it's done." I wanted to scream. Harmony? I spat the word like it was poison. This isn't harmony. It's cruelty. He didn't look at me. He just said quietly, "Please, just gambatte. Try harder. For me." And then he left the room. I lay awake that night, staring at the paper lantern above the bed, wondering if he loved me enough to ever choose me over them. And deep down, I began to doubt it. The house felt colder after that night. Even when the summer heat clung to the tatami mats and the cicadas screamed from the garden, a chill settled inside me, the kind that had nothing to do with weather. I stopped trying to join their conversations. I stopped smiling when I entered a room. I stopped pretending I didn't hear the word gaijin hissed behind my back. Instead, I retreated to the smallest bedroom at the end of the hall, the one his mother had chosen for me because she said it was appropriate for a guest. Guest. Even after months of marriage, that's all I was to them. At night, I sat on the futon, fingers hovering over my phone screen, trying to write to my mother back home. I typed and erased a dozen messages. I'm fine. They don't like me. I think I made a mistake. But in the end, I just sent, miss you. She replied hours later, a simple, come home. You don't have to stay there. I stared at those words, and for a moment I considered it. I imagined packing my suitcases, stepping onto a plane, leaving them all behind. Husband, in-laws, and this unbearable loneliness. But every time I reached for the suitcase, something stopped me. A whisper of pride. A stubborn voice inside me that said, no, not yet. They won't break me that easily. So I stayed. But it wasn't easy. The mornings started with tense silence over breakfast. His father barely glanced at me anymore. His mother sighed dramatically whenever I appeared. And my husband, he became more distant with each passing day. I cried quietly in that little room so many nights, pressing a pillow to my face to muffle the sobs. I began to doubt everything, my place here, my marriage, even my own worth. One evening, after yet another dinner where no one spoke to me, I wandered into the garden alone. The moon hung low, glowing white against the dark sky, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I let myself say the words out loud. Maybe I don't belong here. And yet, as tears slid down my cheeks, I felt something inside me harden. No, I won't leave. Not yet. Not like this. If they want me to disappear, they'll have to push much harder. I'll find a way to make them see me, even if it kills me. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I wouldn't let them win. If I was going to stay, I couldn't keep hiding in that little room. The next morning, I woke early, before even his mother, and sat at the low kitchen table with my laptop open. For hours, I researched videos, blogs, etiquette guides, even dusty old library books from the local community center. I scribbled notes, proper bowing angles, how to present gifts, the right phrases to use at meals. I watched clips of women in Ferisone moving with such graceful precision that it made my chest ache. I was determined to prove them wrong. When his mother finally emerged, her eyes narrowed at the sight of me already there, but I simply smiled and said softly, "Ohayo gozaimasu." Good morning. She gave me a sharp little nod and moved on. That afternoon, I ventured into town and spent what little money I had saved on beautiful wagashi, delicate Japanese sweets, and a soft pink kimono I saw in the window of a second-hand shop. The shopkeeper looked surprised when I bowed and said, "Kore o kudasai." Please, this one. But she smiled and wrapped it carefully. I returned home and cooked for hours. Miso soup from scratch, perfect little tamagaki, simmered vegetables, the house filled with smells that reminded me of the few happy family meals I'd witnessed in this country. When the family sat down for dinner, I wore the pink kimono, my hair neatly tied back, and served them the meal without saying a word, just as I'd read was proper. At first, no one spoke. They just stared. Then his mother finally muttered, "It's edible, at least." It wasn't praise, but it wasn't a slap either. Encouraged, I tried more. Over the next few weeks, I brought them small gifts when returning from errands, always properly wrapped, always presented with both hands. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, even polishing the family altar. I even knelt before his parents one evening and apologized in Japanese for any shame I had brought to the family. "Gomewaku o kakeshite moshiwake arimasen deshita." I am deeply sorry for the trouble I've caused. His father grunted. His mother only sniffed. But deep down, I thought I saw a flicker of something in her eyes that night. Until the next morning, I found the pink kimono, the one I'd saved so hard to buy, hanging from the clothesline outside. It had been ripped to shreds. On the porch, his mother stood, holding a pair of scissors in her hand, her voice low and venomous. "You will never wear this as one of us." For a second, the world seemed to tilt beneath me. Something inside me cracked, and yet, even as my eyes burned, another voice, colder and sharper, began to speak in my mind. "We'll see about that." The silence after her words was deafening. I didn't cry. Not in front of her. Not this time. Instead, I carefully picked up the torn pieces of the pink kimono, folded them in my arms, and walked back inside without looking at her again. That night, while my husband was out late at work and the house was quiet, I sat in the dim light of the office room, staring at my reflection in the glass cabinet. My hands trembled as they traced the embroidery on what was left of the kimono. Something hardened in my chest. If they were going to treat me like an intruder, then maybe it was time I became one. Properly. I stood and began pacing. Then my eyes fell on the heavy oak cabinet in the corner, the one they always kept locked. A faint beam of moonlight glinted off the key still left in the lock. Curiosity won. I turned the key and pulled the doors open. Inside, stacks of ledgers, folders, and polished wooden boxes neatly labeled in kanji. At first glance, it was just company paperwork, until one thick leather folder fell to the floor. It cracked open, spilling out crisp documents, stamped and signed in both Japanese and English. I bent down, frowning, and froze. On the cover page was a name I hadn't thought about in years. My grandfather's. Arthur Maxwell. Page after page bore his name and mine alongside the family company's seal. My eyes flew across the words. Initial investment agreement, shareholding rights, Maxwell Family Trust, 52% ownership. I sank into the chair. It didn't make sense. My grandfather, a reclusive magnate back in New York, who passed away when I was a teenager, had invested in this family's company. Not just invested, but held majority control. I dug deeper into the folder. It was all there. Signed contracts dating back decades, wire transfer receipts in obscene amounts, even handwritten letters between my grandfather and my father-in-law. A note, written in English in my grandfather's bold hand, slipped out of the stack. For my granddaughter, should she ever need it. The world will not hand you respect, child. Take it. I sat there in the dark, the weight of it all pressing down on me. Tears filled my eyes, but this time, they weren't from humiliation. It all made sense now. Why the family had seemed so nervous at the engagement. Why they'd gone through with the marriage despite clearly despising me. They'd hoped I'd never discover the truth. But now, I knew. And for the first time in months, I felt something spark inside me that I hadn't felt since before I boarded that plane. Power. A plan began to form. Not out of spite, but out of resolute. I wasn't going to run anymore. I was going to remind them exactly who I was, and just who kept the ground beneath their feet solid. I shut the folder, tucked it under my arm, and stood tall. Tomorrow, I thought, would be different. I didn't sleep that night. Long after the household had quieted, I sat in the office with the folder spread open in front of me, running my fingers over the embossed stamps and kanji seals. Every page confirmed it. Not only was my grandfather the majority investor in their company, his terms gave me full voting rights as his heir. They've been standing on my family's money this whole time while calling me worthless. At dawn, I made myself a pot of strong coffee and watched the first light break over the narrow street outside. The neighborhood was quiet, but inside me was a storm. I drafted an email to an international law firm in Tokyo that specialized in corporate inheritance cases. Attached scans of the documents. Subject line, urgent, verification of shareholder rights. The response came faster than I expected. Ms. Maxwell, we confirm these are authentic and binding. You hold majority control of the company. Would you like us to assist in enforcing your rights? I read the line 3 times, then typed back. Not yet, but I will need you present at a family dinner tomorrow. Kindly prepare talking points for me. When my husband came home that evening, he found me ironing a dress shirt. You're smiling, he said hesitantly, like he was afraid I'd finally cracked. I'm hosting a family dinner tomorrow, I replied, meeting his eyes for the first time in weeks. For what? To tank your parents, I said, letting the words hang in the air. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't question me further. The next day was a flurry of quiet preparations. I arranged for a caterer, personally selected a sake the father liked, and even ordered a fresh ikebana arrangement for the dining table. But behind the scenes, I rehearsed. I memorized legal terminology in Japanese, practiced my pronunciation until my tongue hurt, and reviewed the hierarchy of bows. If I was going to confront them on their turf, I'd do it flawlessly, with their own rules. When the lawyer called that afternoon to confirm his attendance as my business advisor, I felt something shift in me. For months, I'd begged for acceptance, bowed my head, tried to shrink myself to fit. But tomorrow, they would see me, not as a gaijin, not as a nuisance, but the woman who held their legacy in her hands. And this time, I wouldn't flinch. I set the table myself that evening, polishing each plate, aligning the chopsticks just so. The lawyer arrived exactly at 7, in a dark suit and carrying a briefcase. I tucked the folder neatly inside it and handed him a note. He read it silently and nodded. Understood, Maxwell-san, he said in perfect English, before switching back to Japanese. Watashi ni makasete kudasai. Leave it to me. As I walked back to the kitchen, I caught my reflection in the sliding door. For the first time in months, I recognized the woman staring back at me, composed, calm, unafraid. Tomorrow, I take back my place at this table. The following evening, the entire family gathered around the low dining table in the formal tatami room. The atmosphere was thick, oppressive, and I could feel their eyes on me as I placed the last dish down. My husband sat quietly at my side, his hands folded stiffly in his lap. Across from us, his mother adjusted her kimono and gave me one of her thin, icy smiles. His father cleared his throat and muttered something under his breath that I couldn't quite catch. Kekkon wa machigatta. It sounded like he said this marriage was a mistake. But this time, I didn't shrink. I straightened my back, set down the bottle of sake, and gave the opening bow, deep and deliberate, not as a daughter-in-law begging for scraps of respect, but as an equal about to speak her piece. Arigatou gozaimasu, I began calmly. Thank you for coming. Tonight, I wanted to express my gratitude. For a brief moment, the room went quiet. They exchanged glances, perhaps suspecting another clumsy attempt to ingratiate myself. But then I continued. Over the past months, I've tried hard to understand this family, to learn your ways, your language, your harmony. I looked directly at my mother-in-law. And for a long time, I thought the failure to belong was mine. Her smile froze. That ends tonight. I reached into the briefcase beside me and pulled out the folder. The lawyer, seated discreetly behind me, rose and handed me a document before bowing to the family. "Forgive the interruption," he said in polite and impeccable Japanese, "but Miss Maxwell has requested I clarify certain misunderstandings." I opened the folder and slid a single sheet across the table toward the father. He glanced at it, then froze. I spoke slowly now, in crisp, fluent Japanese that I had rehearsed until my throat ached. "Anata no ie wa watashi no okane de tateiru." Your house stands on my money. Gasps rippled through the room. My husband blinked at me stunned, while his mother's hands trembled on her lap. "These documents," I continued, tapping the page, "show that the company's founding capital came from my grandfather's investments. As his heir, I now hold majority rights. In other words," I paused deliberately, letting the words land, "this family's fortune exists because of me." The father sat back, pale and silent. My lawyer stepped forward. "We have verified these documents through the appropriate channels," he added firmly. "She is within her rights to take full control immediately. But," I cut in here, holding up a hand, "I have no intention of tearing this family apart. Not tonight." Instead, I placed the document back in the folder and stood. "I just wanted you to understand," I said evenly, sweeping my gaze over them all. "I may not have been born here, but this," I gestured around the room, at the house, the family crest hanging on the wall, "this was always mine to claim." My husband finally reached out and clasped my hand, his grip firm for the first time in months. And then, in an astonishing moment I will never forget, his father and mother both lowered their eyes and bowed deeply, for the first time, to me. For a long moment after the bow, nobody moved. The silence in the room was no longer heavy with disdain, but with something sharper, shock, and perhaps respect reluctantly taking root. When his parents finally straightened their backs, they seemed older somehow, smaller. My mother-in-law's hands fidgeted with the hem of her kimono, while my father-in-law studied the document again, as if hoping the words would change. I remained standing, my husband's hand still in mine. Then my father-in-law spoke first. "Gomen nasai." It was barely above a whisper, but I heard it. Everyone did. He cleared his throat and said again, louder this time, "Watashi tachi ga machigatte ita." His wife nodded silently beside him, her lips pressed into a thin line, but her head lowered once more in acknowledgement. The lawyer quietly excused himself and left, his work done, leaving the family alone to absorb what had just happened. For the first time since I arrived in Japan, nobody told me to be patient or to try harder. Nobody called me gaijin. Instead, my father-in-law poured me a cup of sake with shaking hands and set it in front of me without a word. My mother-in-law finally looked me in the eyes and murmured, "Yoku gambatta." You endured well. There was no warmth in her voice yet, but there was something different, an uneasy respect. Over the next few days, the shift became more obvious. At breakfast the next morning, my mother-in-law actually placed a small lacquered dish of miso soup in front of me herself. My father-in-law offered to drive me and my husband to the station. At the next family event, a cousin's wedding, they didn't push me out of the family photographs. Instead, my mother-in-law insisted I stand beside her in the front row. In the neighborhood, word spread faster than I expected. Neighbors who once stared at me when I walked by now nodded and greeted me. One elderly woman even bowed and said, "Omedetou gozaimasu," congratulations. It wasn't just acceptance. It was recognition. Of course, it wasn't perfect. I could still feel lingering resentment behind my mother-in-law's polite smiles, and my father-in-law avoided my gaze whenever possible. But the cruelty, the open hostility, it was gone. And my husband, he looked at me now as though seeing me for the first time. That night, as we lay in bed, he whispered, "I should have stood up for you sooner. I'm ashamed." I squeezed his hand and whispered back, "No more shame, not for either of us." Even in their stiff, awkward way, their parents had acknowledged what they could no longer deny. I didn't just belong here. I owned the very foundation they stood on, and they would never, ever forget it. Months passed, and the seasons shifted around me, a quiet testament to how Japan itself never stops moving, no matter who you are. When the plum blossoms began to bloom in our garden, I found myself walking alone one morning, watching the delicate petals fall onto the stones. It struck me that for the first time since arriving here, I didn't feel like a foreigner in my own home. Not because they had finally embraced me, but because I had finally embraced myself. Life with my husband's family changed slowly but undeniably. His mother began inviting me into the kitchen, sometimes correcting my technique when I made onigiri, but always with softer words now. She even asked me for advice on table settings one afternoon before hosting her Chanoyu tea guests. His father no longer avoided me at meals. In fact, he sometimes asked tentatively about my family's business abroad, as if trying to understand how he could have overlooked it all those years. At the summer festival, when we stood for the family photograph, his mother actually placed her hand lightly on my shoulder before the camera flashed. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a fragile piece. One evening, as my husband and I sat on the engawa, watching the lanterns sway in the warm night air, he said, "You've changed them more than I thought possible." I shook my head gently. "No," I said, "they were never mine to change. I just stopped waiting for their permission to belong." I still remember the words his mother had hissed on my wedding day, "Anata wa kachikanai," meaning, "You are worthless." But when I heard them in my mind now, I smiled instead of flinching, because I knew better. Belonging, I had learned, is not a gift you wait for others to give you. It's something you claim. It's something you build, one quiet act of defiance at a time. Sometimes the deepest roots are planted in the most foreign soil. And sometimes home isn't where they welcome you. It's where you stop apologizing for existing. I watched the moon rise over the garden that night, pale and full, and whispered to myself, softly but loud enough that I knew it was true, "I belong here." If you've ever felt like you didn't belong, if you've ever walked into a room and felt the weight of every stare, every whisper, remember, your worth is not up for debate. Your story, your resilience, your quiet strength, they're yours to define. The world may try to tell you you are worthless, but you get to decide what those words mean. So, if you're ready to hear more stories of love, defiance, and finding yourself between two worlds, subscribe to this channel, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear.